Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, there's a great interest in this subject, and we're absolutely delighted to be hosting this talk at the CSMVS. And we've had quite a journey getting Mishi here. Not Mishi so much, but her book here. Unfortunately, due to a lot of bureaucratic hassles, the book is not here, but you'll hear a lot about the book from her, and I'm sure during the Q&A session. So on behalf of Dr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee and the chairman and trustees of the CSMVS and the members of the Museum Society of Bombay, I extend a really warm welcome to Mishi Saran, to Mr. Menosh Hiramanik, and Harsha Hiramanik, who's not here with us, but they have old Shanghai connections. And we are so delighted that we have in our midst some grand dames who were born in Shanghai and who are with us here today. They have been thoroughly interviewed, investigated, and had to rack their memory because this all took place more than 60 years ago, when they were born there and were raised there. And we all know that what happened to Shanghai. But Shanghai has now developed a life of its own. And we do have several Indian entrepreneurs based in Shanghai, working there. And it's a different world, it's a different city. But we're going to hear about it from a different point of view of over a century ago. A few words about the lecture. Shanghai has a long and well-documented history of foreigners living on its soil. For nearly 2 centuries, from the 19th century Opium Wars right up to 1949, a vibrant international presence blended with the city's tapestry and helped fashion Shanghai's unique flavor. Less known to the world is that Indians of all stripes and colors played a significant role in this process. The Parsis and Bohra Muslim traders, the Sindhis, Sikh Policemen, Sephardic Jews like Victor Sassoon, among others, helped shape the city's destiny. Rabindranath Tagore alighted 3 times on Shanghai's shores, and Subhash Chandra Bose's Indian National Army based considerable troops in Shanghai. The book, Stray Birds on the Huangpu, A History of Indians in Shanghai, a new bilingual. The book is printed in Mandarin and in English. It's an anthology published in Shanghai in 2018 and collects writings from a range of cross-disciplinary contributors and displays a dazzling array of photographic and archival treasures. And if I'm not mistaken, at least one of the contributors or 2 of the contributors is with us here today. So thank you very much for coming. The anthology was curated by Mishi Saran, who wrote several chapters in this book, and first stumbled upon the story of Parsis in Shanghai in 2012, when she heard about Jahangir Bejan Tata, then already in his 90s and living in San Francisco. It was about this time that I got a call from my friend Saka Mistry that would I have time to see Mishi, and of course, greedy as I am, I said immediately, in another hour, she can come and see me. She managed to interview Mr. Tata before his death and wrote some of his life story in a chapter titled A House for Mr. Tata and Old Shanghai Tale. and in a chapter, Traveling In, Traveling Out, a book of unexpected journeys published by HarperCollins, India in 2014. Mishi later gathered the stories of some now scattered Parsis who were raised in Shanghai. Who were they? What were they doing in Shanghai? Her illustrated lecture uncovers the little-known life of Parsi settlers in China's, and I really believe, most enchanting city. A little bit about our speaker for this evening. Mishi Saran first wrote about China as an exchange student in Beijing in 1988-89, and since then has written regularly for global media. She authored the award-winning 2005 Silk Road travelogue, Chasing the Monk's Shadow, a journey in the footsteps of, pardon my pronunciation, Wanzang, published by Penguin in 2005 and again in 2018. Her first novel, The Other Side of Light, which was published by HarperCollins in 2012, was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Book Prize. She has co-edited an anthology, Hong Kong 2020, Reflections on a Borrowed Place, published by Blacksmith Books in 2017, and curated a rare Sino-Indian bilingual collaboration, Stray Birds on the Huangpu, a history of Indians in Shanghai, Shanghai People's first arts publication in 2018, documenting the lives of Indians who settled in Shanghai. I'm happy to announce that she's finishing her second novel, set in the 1930s in Shanghai. And of course, needless to say, she's fluent in Mandarin and speaks basic Cantonese. And if there's anybody who wishes to have a conversation in those two languages, they're most welcome. I won't be any the wiser what they're saying. So thank you very, very much, Mishi. And may I request Mr. Mudit Jain, member of the Executive Committee of the Museum Society, to present a small memento on behalf of all of us to Mishi Saran. Mishi, a small memento for you from all of us. And once again, these lectures are just not possible without the support of an audience, and I welcome all of you here again and appreciate that you have managed to take time off to come here. And I'm very, very appreciative of our sponsors, Harsha and Menosh Hiramanik and the family, for being here with us today and supporting our activities. Mishi, may I welcome you to the podium. It's all yours. Thank you. One last announcement. No, please do come. There will be no Museum Society lectures in the month of February, but please be on the lookout for events because of the Kalagora festival, this particular auditorium and the Kumaraswamy auditorium, and indeed the whole area has been booked for various activities which you should really attend. So we will regroup with Hoyshala Architecture on the 11th of March. Thank you.
Thank you, Feroza. It's lovely to be here. Thank you all for coming. It's really, really lovely to be here. My big thanks to Inchin Closer's Nazia Wazi, who is the organizer, whose idea was it actually, it was for me to come to Mumbai in the first place. And so thank you, Nazia. She's celebrating 10 years of her company, which teaches Mandarin to Indians and basically is in this field of bringing India and China closer together. It's hard work. She's been at it for 10 years and has, and so congratulations. I know how much it takes. This year marks the 70th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the two modern nations of India and China. But as we shall see, our peoples have been entangled for a much longer time, long before India was India and China was China. So thank you, Nazia, for bringing me here and hosting me, and thank you, Firoza, for so kindly setting this up. Can you hear me okay? So Nazia was also key to locating very dear Parsi ladies who we're so happy to have them today with us in the audience as well. Well, except for Ava Vikaji, who sadly passed away a few years ago. And they hold dear their memories of Shanghai. We're delighted that Bepsi Jasuboy and Zareen Lal Kaka, the two Talati sisters, they were born Talatis, are here, and Perin Hiramanek, who was born Karanjia in Shanghai. I'm also delighted, as Firoza mentioned, that, okay, is that better? The two of our contributors, Shabnam Minwala, could be here, and she interviewed her Bohra Muslim uncle and provided a fascinating insight into his life in Shanghai. I might ask her, if she doesn't mind, to talk a little bit about him. And thank you, Rashid, for being here. He's an economic historian. Now, why louder? Okay. Why Shanghai? Why all the fuss about Shanghai? I mean, I'll be really honest. It's a city I personally love. I spent 8 years in Shanghai and became completely mesmerized by the history of Shanghai. You might even say slightly obsessed. And because the echoes of this history are so completely fascinating and so reminiscent of India and indeed Mumbai. This is the Bund. My own work, as Firoza mentioned, on the Parsis of Shanghai began as a complete accident. It might never have happened. It was a chance conversation in Shanghai in the spring of 2012. I was researching my novel, actually, this long in the works novel, and I was trying to do a series of interviews. And I heard about a Parsi gentleman, Jahangir Bejan Tata, who was still alive and living in San Francisco. And my ears just pricked up, and I was actually slightly in shock because by this time, you know, I had been involved with China in one way or another for 25 odd years. Now that's a long time. And it just shows how deeply buried and invisible this story is. And it was the absolute first time I had heard about a Parsi who had settled in Shanghai. Of course, people knew that, you know, Indians were involved in China. I mean, scholar and historian Madhavi Thampi, she wrote a seminal book on the topic called, you know, Indians in China. But it only came out in 2005. And how many have read Amitav Ghosh's trilogy? Anyone? Yeah, so you know how key that was in helping understand the lives of Indians in Shanghai, in China. But nobody had any first-hand accounts, zero. And when I first went to China in 1988, the Chinese didn't even realize I was Indian. They thought I was from Xinjiang, from the western part of China, the Uyghur minority. They would follow me and say, Xinjiang Ran, Xinjiang Ran. And then when they found out that I was Indian, it would sort of be, oh, so can you sing and dance? Because they had seen the movies of Raj Kapoor, and at that time. Now, of course, Amir Khan is just as famous in China. And the Chinese knew back then about Buddhism in China, in India, and they knew about the IT sector. But that was pretty much it. And the history, the fact that all these Indians had settled in Shanghai and lived there and made a house there, not for 10 years, 15 years, going on 200 years, this somehow was almost lost to history. And so I and most Chinese, in fact, knew nothing about the daily life of the Indian inhabitants of Shanghai of the 19th and 20th centuries before 1949, before the communists took over the country. So why Shanghai? There's other cities after all. This is JB. I'll come back to him in a minute. But this is an aerial view of Shanghai. I mean, just this picture always just takes my breath away. It's an archival photo. It's the old recreation center in Shanghai with the race course of the British settlement. You can see the racetrack at the edge of Shanghai. And do remember this image because you will come across, I'll mention the racetrack again as a landmark in Old Shanghai shortly. Now, Shanghai, the characters for Shanghai literally means on the ocean. You can see the 3 drops of water that make up the radical, the water radical. Here, 1, 2, 3. That's the water radical that is involved with any ideograph that has to do with the ocean or the sea or anything to do with water. And so Shanghai is actually the essence of Shanghai has to do with water, and the proximity to water is the essence of the city. Not just the sea out to the east, but this dense network of rivers and creeks that interlace. You see, that is where Shanghai is. I mean, if you think of China as this rooster, if you follow the outline of China, and you think of it, the Chinese actually sometimes say that China looks like a rooster. And then Shanghai is the medal that's sort of pinned on the breast of the rooster, if you don't mind my metaphors. And anyway, so the point I want to make is these rivers and creeks that interlace this lower Yangtze River basin. It's an area so fertile and so lush, the Chinese call it the land of fish and rice. But more than anything, these rivers and creeks served as crucial transport waterways for flat-bottomed barges that bring these hundreds and thousands of tons of goods and people to and from the port city of Shanghai. Now, when Mr. Hugh Hamilton Lindsay, he was a Scotsman, it's always the Scottish people that cause trouble. Anyway, he had been an agent of the East India Company, and he led a covert, very controversial mission up the coast of China to Shanghai on his ship in 1832. And he entered Shanghai on a pretext, and he counted an average of about 400 junks. Junks are these Chinese boats, entering Shanghai weekly in 1 July. Now, if you extrapolate that volume over the year, it made Shanghai really one of the leading ports in the world. It was not a quiet little fishing village, as some of the anglicized and Anglo-centric accounts would paint it. It was a mighty trading center. And Shanghai was closed to foreigners. China was closed to foreigners for trade from about 1760 to 1842, those 80 odd years. The only place the Qing dynasty, the Qing emperor, allowed foreigners to be in and trade in was this tiny little slip of land in Hong Kong, way south. You see Hong Kong? So across from Hong Kong is Canton. So here's a map of Canton. You can see Hong Kong on the bottom right-hand side here. This is Hong Kong and Lantau Island, slightly off. Here's Macau. This is Linton. And this is the mouth of the Pearl River and the Pearl River Delta. And here's Canton, way up here in this corner. And the foreigners could only be in Canton it's 15 tiny acres outside these city walls in Canton up here. They could only be there for 3 months a year during the trading season to do with the winds from September to about January or February. And even that access was given really inch by inch. As early as 1756, one Parsi, Hirji Jivanji Redimani, had made the journey to Canton. Parsi traders who lived here on this narrow strip of land by the water. They were not allowed to go inland. Certainly no women were allowed. The men could only live on shore, and they had to, and in Canton, there still survives an ancient Parsi cemetery from that time. It's now a protected site, thanks to the still active Zoroastrian community of Hong Kong and Macau. There was also a very old settlement in Macau, and there's a cemetery in Macau, Un Parsi cemetery, because the British and the Parsi traders, they used Macau as a foothold before they had landing rights into China. So already by 1809, several enterprising Parsis had settled, and they lived with other Indians on what was called the Chow Chow, or the miscellany factory in Canton. And so say about 1835, just as Lindsay is making his covert trip up the coast, there were about 52 Parsis living in Canton, all male. And the numbers grew steadily, and one Parsi, Jamshed Porter, who died in about 1837, he made the journey, apparently, the records say, about 42 times. So there really was a lot of back and forth between Canton and... Now, why did they have to retreat to Macau? Because, I mean, Macau at the time was under Portuguese administration, and the British and everybody else had to beg the Portuguese for help, because the Portuguese had a much earlier start, as you know, from Bombay as well, in the region, and they had much better access to China. And in those days, it's called the time of the Canton factories. They weren't factories, they were more like warehouses or residential areas for the foreign traders. And what were they trading? The Chinese wanted nothing from the British but silver bullion. The British traders hadn't had much luck in India either. They had offered piles of broadcloth, this thick wooden cloth, to the Mughal emperor, to Jahangir. He had no idea what to do with it. He was more accommodating. He ended up using it, I read somewhere, as padding for the palanquin on his elephant. Rashid, correct me if I'm wrong. The only thing the Chinese wanted was silver. I mean, literally the word silver is the basis of China's financial system. The Chinese word for bank is yinhang, which literally means silver company. So they wanted silver, but they had tea and silks and ceramics and hundreds of other things the British were perfectly happy to buy. And a word about tea. Why were the British buying increasing amounts of tea? And what does it have to do with this woman? Anyone recognize her? She is Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese noblewoman who was married off to King Charles II on a summer's day in 1661. He was actually horrible to her, and even hired his mistresses to be her handmaids. I thought that was particularly mean. Anyway, she brought her fabulous dowry, incredible riches, and the 7 islands of Bombay to England as part of her dowry. But also, she brought the Portuguese habit of drinking tea to the English court, and Britain became very quickly seriously addicted to tea. China was the only place they could obtain tea, and Canton was the only place they could buy it. And so by about 1780s, Britain was running this heavy, serious trade deficit. The silver bullion in the treasury is flowing out to China. And by 1805, Britain was importing something like 24 million tons of tea annually from China. And they were desperately casting about for something else they could sell to China that China would want to try and adjust this balance. Rashid, the economic historian, is staring at me beadily. So anyway, fast forward to the 1820s. I won't go into all the details here, because I just have to tell you all this, because then the rest of it will make more sense. Fast forward to the 1820s, and the British traders have stumbled on a stunning solution. They have somewhere along the way figured out that somehow these little chests of opium that the sailors carried with them individually on ships, they managed to miraculously sell everything, always. They never had trouble selling opium. And so slowly they realized they could just sell opium, which is of course banned in China, but that's not a problem. In the first, and so they started doing it, and in the first 50 years of the 19th century, they had wiped out China's trade surplus. And by about 1823 or so, the export of opium overtakes the export of cotton. It's a dirty business. It's always been a dirty business. Everybody knew it was a dirty business. The EIC, the East India Company, that's why they did not publicly trade opium. They were too proper, too pakka. They didn't want to mess with public opinion in Britain. But they did everything else. They produced it, they processed it, they packaged it, and packed it in mango wood chests, sent it off to the auctions in Canton, and at that point, got somebody else to do their dirty work for them. And these private merchants brought the opium to outside Canton at the mouth of the Pearl River. So what happened is the ships would come up to here. You know, they weren't allowed access, but they would, this is Linton Island, if I'm not mistaken. And the ships would anchor here. The Chinese traders, wholesalers over here in Canton, they would bring their silver bullion to the offices, to the trading offices in Canton, deposit the silver in the trading offices and get certificates, little pieces of paper. Bring the certificates down the river to these boats waiting here with the cargo, exchange it for opium, and everybody could keep their hands clean, and they had the silver was now available for the British to buy goods in Canton. Now, this is where the country trade starts. And it was a big mix of traders. The Scots were there, of course, they're everywhere. Jardine Matheson, William Jardine, Parsis, Bohra Muslims. Jamshedji Gigi Boy was a very powerful, brilliant merchant, very close friends. Well, I don't know friends. They were business associates with William Jardine. They conducted a long and detailed correspondence, which can be found in the archives of in Mumbai at the university. He was an extremely powerful merchant, and it is said he supplied 1/3 of the opium in the Jardine warehouses in Canton. It is said, I read somewhere, that if he was in a bad mood, he could shut down the entire market. And this magnificent oil portrait of him hangs to this day on the top floor of Jardine House in Hong Kong. Now, Jardine House is a tall building with hundreds of round windows right in Hong Kong's central business district. Now, I think these windows are meant to hark back to the round porthole windows in ships. But the Cantonese, I've heard, call it, okay, close your ears, I'm going to say a bad word. They call it the building of 10,000 assholes. Sorry. Now, the Chinese naturally were not also happy about their silver deficit, not to mention the horrors of, millions of people addicted to opium. And Commissioner Lin Zexu, this very upright official, was sent down to confiscate the opium supplies and get rid of them. And it's worth noting that about 7,000 opium chests of the 20,000 that he confiscated belonged to Indian traders. And it was the perfect excuse the British had been looking for. Lindsay has done his recce. He's realized that there's a lot of riches to be had, amazing ports, market access, if only they could convince the Chinese. And now they have the excuse. Boom, Opium War. The Chinese lose it just in weeks. And to be honest, the Qing emperor didn't really think of it as a war. He sort of thought of it, in the Qing records, it's referred to as a border disturbance or a border skirmish. But very quickly, the implications were so enormous and so large that they couldn't really ignore it. And here we have the Treaty of Nanjing, which the Chinese call the unequal Treaty of Nanjing, because of the reparations that the Chinese had to pay to Britain, and Britain was ceded, Hong Kong was ceded to Britain as a crown colony, and 5 other cities, Canton, Xiamen, Fuzhou, and Ningbo, were opened up as treaty ports, and of course, Shanghai. Now, when the British planted the flag, you can see these are the treaty ports, and later more were opened up for business. When the British planted the flag in Hong Kong on Possession Point, over here somewhere, it was 1841. It was Queen Victoria had not yet ratified the treaty. It took a while for the documents to go back and forth between England and Canton and Nanjing and Shanghai. But right, they raised a toast to the Queen, planted the flag, Hong Kong was now Crown Colony, and right alongside them were the Parsi gentlemen Pestonji Kawasji, Rastamji Dhunji Shaw, and Framji Talati. And right alongside the British, the Parsis made significant land purchases at the auction. Several Parsi firms moved their operations to Hong Kong and Shanghai. The Parsis in Hong Kong established Zoroastrian associations, cricket clubs, their own cemeteries, and went on to play a key role in building Hong Kong's infrastructure. And very quickly, by about 1845, the Parsi merchants in Hong Kong began to drift north to Shanghai. And according to one source, the original 4 or 5 Parsi traders settled in Shanghai in 1847. That's very quickly after the Opium War. They came to Shanghai as representatives of their head offices in Hong Kong. They opened branch offices for the sale of opium, Indian cotton, and cotton yarn. They came without their families and left every 2 or 3 years to join their families in Bombay. And of course, it quickly became clear that for life to be bearable on this wilderness, this outpost of China, they needed a place to worship, and they needed a cemetery by necessity. And so they wired their compatriots in Canton for help. Send us money. This is really the Wild West. And so the Shanghai settlers received $700 on the 18th of March in 1854 by demand draft from the Canton Zoroastrian Association. And they bought this plot of land and built this cemetery on Fuzhou Road, which was close to the end of the Tibet Road, which was regarded as the outskirts of the city. I'll show you, I'll go back to this map. You see do you remember the race course I showed you at the beginning? This is that race course. This was the British settlement right here, under the Suzhou Creek, to the south of the Suzhou Creek. You can see the faint outlines of the old Chinese city right here. Now, after the British signed the contract, of course, everybody else wanted to come rushing in. So the French got a little wedge of land here, which became the French concession. And the Americans got this chunk of land up here, which was the American settlement. They were neutral during the war. But then they said, well, we don't want to leave China to the tender mercies of the British. We better be in there as well. And they negotiated with the Qing dynasty, as did the French. Later on, these two were amalgamated to make the international settlement. So in essence, Shanghai, this part of Shanghai, was 3 completely different cities. Now, of course, I went down to, once I learned from J.B. Tata, J.B. Tata told me about the existence of this cemetery. And then later, when I met Bepsi and Zareen and Perrin, I learned more. And I'll tell you why. You can see the Chinese says Bai Toran, or what is it? I can't see. I can't get my glasses out. Sorry. Bai To Li Bai Tang, which is the white hatted prayer area, and this was the white hats. The Chinese call the Parsis the white hats because of the priests wearing the white hats, and this is Moody, which is the cemetery. Of course, I immediately went down, bicycled down to Fuzhou Road to see what was there, but of course all that had been torn down, and instead they had built this hotel. But I feel like this was some sort of strange echo of perhaps what they found there, but maybe I was just imagining it. Now, once I began looking, it seemed like there were Indians all over Shanghai and other parts of China. And we began to excavate for this book the story of the firm Abdul Ali Ibrahim and Company. By piecing together this family tree, I found the 5th generation direct descendant of the Abdul Ali Ibrahim, who still own the brand of Abdul Ali Ibrahim. And there's other branches of the family, of course. But that firm was formed in 1842 and was still in business, based in Hong Kong today, still deeply involved with China. Of course, today they're trading kitchenwares and supply quality goods to major global brands. But the Bohra Muslims lived and traveled and worked in Shanghai. I met in Hong Kong a Sindhi gentleman, Mr. Mohan Gidumal. Yes, you remember him? That's right, he was at school with Bepsi, they were all at school together. And this is his sister, Janki, who was actually born in Shanghai. Mohan himself was born in Canton. His father worked for Pohumal and Co., which was a big Sindhi trading firm, and then went on to open his own business. Janki was the only sibling actually born in Shanghai, but the family later moved to Shanghai, and Mohan and all the kids grew up in Shanghai. Mohan's father was arrested by the Japanese as a prisoner of war and sent off to Tokyo, and that's a whole story that we tell in the book. But this is Mohan at his school, the Shanghai British School, in 1947. This is him at the back. Now the story of the Sikhs, did you see him? Yes. The story of the Sikhs in Shanghai is slightly better known because of how visible they were on Shanghai streets. I'm just curious, how many people knew there were Sikh policemen in Shanghai? Right. So the Sikh, so they were a very visible component of the Indian presence in Shanghai, these big burly Indians with their beards. And in fact, elderly Shanghainese today still remember when they were little, their parents used to frighten them and say that in Shanghainese they're called the Hongto Ase, which means red-hatted sir or asan, or the etymology is a little bit. And they would say that they're going to come and get you, so you better be a good boy. And that is partly exactly why the British brought their Sikh battalions into and garrisons into Shanghai. It was the classic divide and conquer business. They were, these big, tall guys. They didn't speak Chinese. And I mean, it's very interesting though, because this linguistic things, I have a friend in Shanghai, and she said to me that, there's a Shanghainese expression that says, okay, this is more bad language, I'm so sorry. There's a Shanghainese expression that is gandala, as in like, you're so stupid. That is, it's not Mandarin, it's Shanghainese, ni gandala. And she thinks, nobody can trace where this word comes from. And she thinks that it came from these Punjabi, these Sikh guys, cursing at the Chinese as gandu. This is Shanghai. The Shanghai is like this massive hybrid. I promise you, I don't always talk about these things. Shanghai was this massive hybrid. There was linguistic interaction. There was food going back and forth. The Chinese learnt about tubular. They saw spaghetti for the first time. They have noodles. And the thing that astonished the Chinese was that, my God, the Westerners eat hollow noodles. That was incredible to them. Anyway, I'm digressing. So the Sikhs in Shanghai. Now, the interesting thing about this story is also the connections between how much of the Shanghai story lands in Hong Kong. Just on a hunch, I went to see Avtar Singh Sangatpura. He was the head of the Gurdwara in Hong Kong. And of course, I learned that his father had been an active member of and served in the Shanghai police force, and had also been a card-carrying member of the Indian Independence League. The British were petrified that the Chinese would learn about the Indian independence movement, and closely watched all mail coming in from Shanghai, and the British secret police spied on their own employees to make sure that the Sikh troops stayed loyal to them. There's plenty of drama and assassinations, and it's all in our book. Now, a quick word before we get to J.B. Tata. I know you think I've forgotten about him. I have not. A quick word about the Sassoons, because of so much Sassoon building in Bombay. David Sassoon arrived quite late to the scene, but he had established in 1832 he landed. 13 years later, he already had an office in Shanghai. The urban legend about the Sassoons, at least in Shanghai, is that the Sassoons were getting all their mail at a post office here in Bombay, right next to a British businessman, and they noticed that this British businessman kept getting all this mail from Shanghai, and the Sassoons decided they better go to Shanghai and see what on earth was going on there. And very quickly, the Sassoons began to nibble into the Parsi share of the trade. The steamships were available by the 1860s, and suddenly it was 4 times more expensive to ship opium to China on a Gigi Boy clipper. So the Parsis diversified, returned to tried and true cotton. At any rate, right around them, in the 1860s, there'd been so much trouble in China. The Taiping Rebellion was a massive civil war in China. 14 terrible years, 20 million people died. And Chinese refugees from the interior began flooding into these British settlements governed by the foreigners. They were not poor. These are not poor. They came with, bars of gold. They needed houses. They needed places to stay. And suddenly, all the foreign traders and businessmen in Shanghai in these settlements realized they could just provide housing. So they began to build. And real estate prices began to shoot up. Now, during my, and this is Sassoon House being built. The original one was torn down. Victor Sassoon, when he moved to Shanghai, moved all his wealth in 1831, decided to build this brand new swanky hotel, which became the Peace Hotel, one of the most glamorous hotels in the Far East. But we won't talk too much about the Sassoons right now. But during my research for this book, what struck me again and again was how these Indians who are involved with China were involved with China for generations. And just for fun, this is my scribbled, scratched kind of sketch trying to piece together the Shroff family tree. It's a family from Busar in Gujarat. And I've circled in neon green all the people in the family who were in Shanghai. And just look at this amazing, there's endless brothers, and then the nephews, and then the cousins, and of course, you have a nephew there, and then you will send your son to stay with the uncle, then they work together, and then the son will set up his own business. And there was a huge presence in Shanghai for generations. And Neville, who's down here, Neville Shroff in Hong Kong, he's now based in Hong Kong, but he still does business with Shanghai. I mean, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, also 5 generations of involvement with China. These are huge legs of time. This is Rusi Shroff, one of Hong Kong's best known and most loved philanthropists and businessmen, and his lovely wife Pervez. This picture was taken just a few weeks before his 100th birthday in Hong Kong. He died shortly after this picture was taken, but he was born in Shanghai. His father was Motabai Shroff, who was living in Shanghai, and his wife, Tehmina Shroff, she decided she just couldn't bear Shanghai weather, and she moved down to Hong Kong with the children to live with her relatives from her mother's side, the Ratanjis. And unfortunately, Motabai drowned in a terrible typhoon accident. He was coming down from Shanghai to Hong Kong to visit for his daughter's Navjot ceremony, and the ship sank. So the Ratanjis adopted the 3 children, and then the mother died a few years later. So the Ratanjis adopted the 3 Shroff orphans, and which is how Rusi Shroff came to be managing the Ratanji empire. All this to say that basically you scratch the surface a tiny little bit and you will find a Shanghai connection. This business of generational involvement with China spills over even into modern Indians. I ended up writing a chapter on the diplomatic history of the Menons. Because do you remember I mentioned Madhavi Thampi, the woman who wrote the book on the Indians in China? Well, I met her in Bangalore. I wanted her to contribute some chapters to our anthology. And we had this long discussion about the book and how to plan it and who else could we get to write and how to, there was all this excitement. And I just happened at the end of this lovely long conversation, I happened to ask her, Madhavi, how did you get interested in China? She said, she'd been teaching at Delhi University for years and years. And she said, well, my mother, I grew up in this house which was filled with stuff from China. My mother spoke Chinese and she was always so interested in China. And I said, why was your mother in China? And she said, well, she went to college in China. She was there during her college years. So, I'm going, why was she in college in China? And it turns out that Madhavi Thampi is and I'm sure she won't mind me telling the story, it's in the book. She's the granddaughter of KPS Menon, who was one of the first diplomats who was sent to China. KPS Menon landed in China before, I think, I forget the exact date, but it was before India was independent. So he couldn't be called an ambassador. He was called an agent general, KPS Menon, and he landed in Chongqing. He presented his credentials to Chiang Kai-shek, and along with him was his wife and his daughter. KPS Menon was a famous diaryist. This is his diary entry, which is in the archives, at Teen Murti Archives in Delhi. I made a lightning visit to Delhi, spent 2 days, and had a look through all these Shanghai entries. So this is him when he came back as ambassador. No, 1947, he's not yet ambassador. But he's doing a visit to Shanghai, and he's calling on Madame Sun Yat-sen, that is Song Qingling. Here's what he says. Song Qingling, she was a little fatter and older than before. It's nice as ever. It's so nice to see her. Presented her with, I think that says Bollywood guts, I'm not sure what that is, and gave her Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's letter. So there's all these amazing references to Shanghai. And in fact, in one of the stories that Roshan Mehta, one of our interviewees, tells, when she was leaving Shanghai, she was settled, she was helped out to get on a boat by KPS Menon. So in our book, at the end of this, there were all these funny cross-references, people referring to each other. We have pictures of Bapsi's Navjot in Shanghai, where there's a Barma auntie who's sitting in the background. And the community was small enough and knew each other, except, of course, the Sikh policemen who were sort of out in the streets. Anyway, circling back, finally, to J.B. Tata. And it's thanks to him that all these stories kind of came pouring out. You know, J.B. or Jangu, as his contemporaries called him. I mean, after I did all these interviews with him on Skype, he was quite hard of hearing. But somehow Skype was okay. I was in Shanghai, he was in San Francisco. And I finally made it to San Francisco, and this is him at his home. He was aged 93. It was about a year before he died. And he said, you know, he was quite fragile. He said we should call him the fall guy because he kept falling. But he remembered snatches of Shanghainese. He remembered, his memory was clear as a bell. And what was the story that he told me was the story of his father's house and his father. And so here we are. This is Bejan Dadaboy Tata. Let's sort of cycle back to the 1900s and the Tatas. The Parsis have been coming to China for nearly 150 years. This is not a new story. They've been present in Shanghai for just over 50 years. And B.D. Tata sailed off from Surat to explore the Far Eastern markets for his company. He worked for R.D. Tata. I mean, the Tata family in India needs no introduction. Jamshedji Tata, the grand old man, had a first cousin called R.D. Tata, who was keen to open up the markets. But R.D. was busy in 1904. R.D. had a French wife who was giving birth in France, Chutu, J.R.D. Tata. And so in 1904, R.D. Tata sent his cousin, a distant cousin. I've never quite established the exact cousin linkage, but they were distantly related. He sends B.D. Tata to investigate Japan and China and see what's going on there. And so B.D. arrived in Shanghai. He was going to be the agent for R.D. Tata. He was working with 2 mills, 2 factories that used raw cotton imported from India to produce yarn and make bed sheets for export. And Shanghai was, of course, it was a boom town. The sky was the limit. You needed no papers to land here, no visas. You could just show up and start work. He found a house right at the Rue du Consulat in the French concession, right behind the French consulate. And Perrin's family lived right next door or nearby to, and Roshan Mehta's family lived right at the Rue du Consulat, the Mehta family. And Roshan Mehta could look down from her house into the French consulate, and she told me that she would see all these these fancy women on Bastille Day, massive ball the French would have, and all these women would show up in their beautiful gowns and play the Marseillaise, etc., etc. Anyway, Shanghai was exploding with construction. It was safe to settle down. B.D. Tata went back to India to find a nice Parsi woman to marry and bring her back to the Far East, and they had 5 children. Now for the Parsis, their social life centered around the prayer hall before this thing was here. And by B.D. Tata was a recognized member of Shanghai's small but growing, Parsi community. And in, the fund was very active. They had a fund, they had the Parsi Cemetery Fund. Bepsi, I know about the Parsi Cemetery Fund because Bepsi's father, Mr Talati, was deeply involved in the fund, and they had a book about the history of this Parsi Cemetery Fund, which she gave me, and it was a gold mine of information on what the fund did. They would send support a Zoroastrian girls' school in Persia. They sent money for a hospital in Bombay. And in 1918, in December, just 2 days before Christmas, the Cemetery Trust Fund, they had an extraordinary meeting, and it was proposed that a social hall and a new prayer hall should be built. And the resolution says, taking into consideration the fairly large community comprising males, females, and children, and the total lack of facilities for a suitable place for assembling to celebrate any social, religious, or joyful occasions among them. And B.D. Tata seconded this, and he said that for the last 16 years he'd been noticing the inconvenience to the community because of the lack of a social hall. And I'm sort of calculating and thinking, well, his wife was 4 months pregnant with twins, and of course he was going to support a social hall. Anyway, JB used to joke. He would joke that he was always very polite. So when he and his twin sister, Alu, were about to be born, he said, ladies first, and so Alu was born first. And JB was born in May in 1919 in Shanghai, and when he was 13 years old, this brand new prayer hall was opened, which Bepsi's father was seminally involved with. Now, JB remembers, his memory was incredibly clear about life in Shanghai. He remembers going to this garden on the Bund with his Chinese ama. This is what it looked like in the early 1900s. He remembers having this kerfuffle with this little English girl who threw sand in his face. Then he threw sand into her sandwich, and the amas began to fight. And B.D. Tata, his father, and Najamai, they tried to teach their kids Gujarati, but they answered in English. The Chinese staff that they had, they spoke pidgin English, and JB went to a boys' school. By 1926, B.D. Tata was doing well enough to think about buying some land and building a house, and this is the title deed that was photographed by JB's brother Sam. He picked an area just outside the international settlement. It was just coming up, probably the outskirts of the town. I'm guessing he got a very good price for it, and he could rent it in perpetuity. And this is the property, that was his grand plan. He would build a main gracious villa with 4 smaller semi-detached villas at the back for his sons. It was a very Indian idea, actually, to have the 4 houses for his sons. His one daughter, Alu, was going to get the big house. One of the nieces emailed me to remember to say that, because he was a very fair man. And the lawns would surround the property. So he hired this. I found the map. I found the house on this map. You see, this is on this old map of Shanghai. This is the plot of land. This would have been the big house. These were the lawns, and these were the 4 blocks at the back. And he called the estate Avan Villa after his mother in India. The house was ready in 1935, and the Tata clan moved westwards across Shanghai into their new digs. This is a picture of one of the back houses. And here we have, now he was a prominent and very respected member of the Parsi community. He was a trustee of the Shanghai Parsi Cemetery Trust Fund. And he had been part of numerous agreements and disagreements and court cases. He would gather the whole community at his house for celebrations. He lent money to the younger Parsis who hoped to start up their own businesses, and generally was a patriarch of this very close-knit community. And this is one of the reasons why this Navjot ceremony, Hosang Karanja, who's the younger brother of Perrin, who's here with us, had his Navjot ceremony in Shanghai in 1941, gathered in B.T. Tata's house. Where is Hosang? Do you want to point out Hosang, Perrin? Chinese business associates are here. So they're really associated with the people they worked with. And you can see in here, also I just heard today the most amazing story about the Pettigaras, who married a Chinese woman. And Dr. Pettigara, anyway, if Avan Gidumal was here, she would tell you the amazing story of the Dr. Pettigara. But there's also a French doctor in here, Dr. Santelli. But just, it sort of is a microcosm of what Shanghai was, this incredible mixed society, international. And this is the house that Jahangir Tata, J.B. Tata, spent 15 years in. He lived here till he was 30 years old. He remembers every corner of it. There were 7 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, parquet floors, a prayer room. His parents each had their own bedroom. There was a study. There were 2 beautiful murals by a famous Russian bas-relief done by a Shanghai artist called Podgorsky, Russian but living in Shanghai. There were quarters for the staff. They had a boy. They had a cook. And it was here that Jahangir met Lydia, the beautiful Russian, this beautiful young white Russian girl whose family had moved to Shanghai when the Bolsheviks won the war in 1917. Now Sam Tata, the brother of JB, this is just pictures of the house. He was a fairly scruffy fellow. He was artistic. He liked photography. He would cross the road into the French concession and hang out with the Russian art students. And this is where he met Lydia. He was taking drawing and painting classes. And hers was a very different story. Her father had been killed in the 1931 bombing of Shanghai. She worked to support her mother and her grandmother. She could only paint at night. Anyway, so he invited her back. He said, come up, and this is how JB told the story. He said, come up and look at my etchings. And Lydia, feeling highly suspicious, took some friends with her. Anyway, they went along, and there she met JB. And that's how they met, basically. And their jaws dropped when this scruffy Sam Tata led them to this incredibly beautiful, modern mansion. And there was young JB, who was, charismatic. He was a bodybuilder. He was funny. He was handsome. And anyway, by the time this picture was taken, Hosang Karanjia's Navjot, it was 1941. The Japanese were occupying Shanghai. So this is actually under Japanese occupation. The Tata mills that Bejan has been running so far were confiscated, and everybody was just trying to get by. There was rationing of sugar and eggs and milk. JB was an amateur dramatist, and he performed these comedic sketches. And he did a sketch, pretending to be a Sikh policeman trying to get passage home to India from the Japanese authorities. And Sam Tata roamed Shanghai with his with his camera, he was sensing enormous change in the air, even across the Himalayas in India. Sam had in fact gone to India. He came to Mumbai in 1947 to photograph the Indian independence movement and Gandhi. And in Bombay, at an exhibition in 1948, he met Henri Cartier-Bresson, the famous French photographer, and the two became very good friends. And in fact, when Sam Tata returned to Shanghai, Henri Cartier-Bresson came with him, bringing his Indonesian wife, and they stayed at Avan Villa, photographing the events of 1949. And here Sam Tata captured the tension of war in Shanghai. This is a Kuomintang guard post on the Bund. The nationalists had already lost the war to the communists, but nobody was saying so. Many just couldn't believe it, that this was the end of Shanghai, that the communists would... Henry Luce, who headed Life magazine, refused to print the articles that his correspondents were sending him from Shanghai, reporting that this dream in Shanghai, in China, was over, and that the US-supported Kuomintang was done for. Those on the ground, both Chinese and foreign, knew it all too well, however, and fled Shanghai carrying whatever they could. And this is Sam roaming around Shanghai, taking pictures. There was a massive exodus of foreigners, and of course, anyone who could beg, borrow, or steal a passage on a boat called in old favors and did so. Or they took the train to the north in Tianjin and boarded troop ships to Hong Kong, or whatever it took. The nuns had to leave under communism. Religious activity, of course, was out of the question. The activities of the Parsi Cemetery Trust Fund and the prayer hall too had to be wound up. And in early 1949, the Zoroastrian priests all left, and the prayer hall in Fujolu stopped holding religious activities. The key, by the way, to that cemetery, to that prayer hall, is now held by a young gentleman, a young Parsi in Hong Kong, who... Bepsi, do you want to tell the story of your father? Her father, Mr. Talati, was the last one to leave Shanghai, and he had the last Parsi to leave Shanghai. And he had with him the key to this prayer hall, which then found its way safekeeping to this young man now who lives in Hong Kong. Yeah. Did you hear that? Of course, everybody wanted to stay on. Nobody ever wanted to leave Shanghai, including myself. Anyway, so the communists, when they came, they held victory parades through Shanghai. And Sam Tata was still taking pictures Henri Cartier-Bresson style. And early in 1949, B.D. Tata and his wife left Shanghai, leaving their children to try and wrap up the family's affairs. Jahangir and Lydia were trying to get married. They were trying to get a marriage certificate from the communist government and an exit permit. They rented out Avan Villa to the Communist Party of China's health department. And remember, everybody, including Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, sort of rather hoped the communists would be a short-term thing. Jahangir and Lydia left on New Year's Eve at the end of 1952. And in March 1953, the chairman of the board of trustees, that's when Mr. Talati left, 1953. That's the date that I read somewhere. Is that right? Does that sound right? 1953? So, and then when he left, there were no Zoroastrians left in Shanghai anymore. Now, in Hong Kong, in July 1954, the Tatas heard that by order of the Shanghai municipal government, all foreign real estate agencies had ceased operation. The trickle of news stopped as the curtain fell on Shanghai, as China underwent decades of political convulsion. But until the day he died, I think JB never stopped hoping he'd get his house back. But I hope it helps explain why the story just, this kind of shroud fell over Hong Kong and everything was buried like Pompeii or something under layers of ash and time. And the story would have died if we hadn't found him by this amazing stroke of luck. And the story of his yearning, of his search, of his life in Shanghai really was the gateway to all these other stories. And I think we will all forever be in his debt. So thank you, JB. Thank you, ladies, for all your wonderful stories. Thanks. I'll leave it there.
I have just one question. How big was the Parsi population in Shanghai?
So
Between
JB,
1900 till the communists came.
it was never more than about 200, and it was quite a shifting population, but about 200, and it was a small and very closely knit community.
Thank you.
For how long did the other communities stay there? I mean, obviously the police were out.
Yes.
But what about the Bohras and the Jews and the Sindhis?
Everybody left. Victor Sassoon left. The Bohras all left. Shabnam, where is Shabnam? I think she may have had to leave. She's gone. That's so sad. Anyway, but everybody was affected by it. The Petiguras, I just heard that Dr. Pettigura, Alec Pettigura's wife and children, because they were considered Chinese, could stay on until 1961. But everybody else, most people, out of either fear or just being thrown out, left China. A lot of the Sikh policemen tried to, they went to Hong Kong or to Malaysia or to, back home, were repatriated. There was some talk of absorbing the Sikh policemen into the new Chinese police force, but it didn't really happen.
My uncle, Yahya Lama, lived in 1949. Japan after that.
So, sorry, can you say that one into the mic?
My uncle and Shabnam's uncle left in 1949, and he then went Hong Kong, then to Japan, where he spent most of his later years in life.
Thank you. Do you know what happened, the circumstances of how he left and how he managed to get out?
No, I'm afraid I don't. He came to Hong Kong first and then
Yes.
Japan.
Thank you so much.
Ma'am Sulekha here. Just having heard you, wondered whether this book has in a way focused on people who have the money and the titles and who had the good fortune to buy land and stay there. Have you in any way been able to talk about those people who were marginalized, who were outside the society, that Sikh men that you spoke about, or the workers who lived in these houses, those migrants who didn't have this kind of privilege? Without being, I'm not being communist when I'm saying that.
No, actually in our book, we have actually 3 chapters on the Sikh population. You're absolutely right. The Sikh population was separate from the others because these guys were wealthy merchants and the Sikhs were, in the police force. They had their own gurdwara. That community did not mix. They were, but interestingly, so there's one of our contributors who's a Chinese scholar, Cao Yan, who works at Tsinghua University. He's written an amazing book about the Sikhs in Shanghai, and he has contributed a chapter to our book. We also had someone called Meena Vatyam, who just had an amateur interest, but she was collecting all these postcards and found amazing stories about the Sikh and photographs of the Sikh community. Madhavi Thampi in her book also documents the Gadar movement, which leaked into Shanghai as well, and we have the story of this this assassination of Buddha Singh, who was assassinated in cold blood because of the infighting between Sikh factions who were pro the British and those who were pro independence. And so that story was playing out in Shanghai as well to an extraordinary extent. So we actually do have quite a lot of coverage. In the Jewish lot, I mean, yes, we talk about the Sassoons and the Kaduris and Ezra, but we know that there were marginalized, poorer Jews who were helped a lot by these wealthier communities. And actually, the Sephardic Jews were the first ones to come to Shanghai, but there was a second wave in, the Russian pogroms that happened, anti-Jewish, the persecution. So those Jews came to Shanghai. Then after the war, the White Russians came. And then in 1938, after the whole world closed the doors to Jews in Europe, if you could get out of Europe and get on a boat to Shanghai, you could still find and make some sort of a life, also in a ghetto, but not persecuted.
So you do have some stories of those marginalized communities, is it? Or were you able to trace that history by any chance?
So lots of work has been done by, are you talking about the Jews, do you mean? Or
No, ma'am, the marginalized community who went from India.
Yes, so people are, so Cao Yin, for example, and Dr. Jankar are working on that. I focused on the Parsi communities and the people that I had stumbled on by chance. And so I wrote, those were the bits that I had researched.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mishi. I think it was an excellent lecture on oral history. The value of oral history is what Mishi tried to show us all, which we are all neglecting. History of kings and queens is known, but we don't tend to concentrate upon community life anywhere. And if you really want to know about the Parsi community which stayed over there, and she has really gone and taken it from that person who no longer exists, 93 years old, Jahangir Tata. So something which is very important for us, for history students, that if you really want to document our world, it's a globalized world, you have to take into consideration oral history. Record all these things which happened. Perhaps the ruins of the Tower of Silence over there in the prayer hall might be yet there. We don't know, we have to go and hunt for it. And further deeper into China also you'll find even more. But do we have really got the guts? I was just thinking about it, that they had the opium trade, and right across over here, because they went from this Masjid Bandar over here, we have across at Kalaba Devi Bhangwadi. So when they used to get the opium from there at Bhangwadi, they used to stay, they said, give it to the Parsis and go back. Every house over here, staying, especially us, we have things from China which has been brought by the Parsis to us, the Parsi community. Our saris also, we have taken from there, the Chinese designs also, everything, each and everything. So actually I thank you for creating a new history of Shanghai, which we have never ever done. So congratulations to you. On behalf of the Museum Society of Bombay, I thank Mr. and Mrs. Shiromani for, you can say, sponsoring this program. I thank Mishi. Please do come again. We want to hear more from you. And we would also like to, you can say, see your book. Thank you. So see you all in March 11. Till then, have a good time. Enjoy Kala Ghoda Festival.